is a Fox News special report.
Good afternoon. I'm Mike Emanuel in Washington. In just a few moments, the official state funeral for Jimmy Carter will continue at the United States Capitol building, where America's longest living former president will lie in repose following a special ceremony at the Capitol Rotunda. Rebecca Castor is live on Capitol Hill. And Rebecca, what is the mood like there?
Mike, good afternoon. The mood is certainly somber here on Capitol Hill, but you can also feel the amount of respect in the air for a former president who accomplished so much in his last 100 years. Right now, Jimmy Carter's casket is currently being drawn by a horse-drawn carriage known as a caisson from the U.S. Navy Memorial to the Capitol building. And according to the Navy, Carter himself chose the Navy Memorial as the site of transfer when planning his own funeral. It's, of course, in honor of his time in the Navy, as well as his time at the Naval Academy. He's the only commander-in-chief to graduate from there. And then the Carter family is walking with the carriage, similar to how Jimmy Carter walked from the U.S. Capitol to the White House on his inauguration day in 1977. So very moving display to see them mirror that procession as well. So after today's ceremony at the Capitol, the public will have the opportunity to say farewell to the 39th president starting this evening. It's going to open to the public at 7 p.m. and remain open until midnight. And then it will be open all day tomorrow before Jimmy Carter's funeral at the National Cathedral on Thursday.
Rebecca, it's worth noting for folks across the country that it is very cold here in Washington. It feels like temperature in the low 20s, and Washington, D.C. got its first significant snowfall in about 3 years. And yet there are a lot of folks turning out for this farewell to a former commander-in-chief. What are you seeing on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, it's very moving to see how many people turned out to say their farewells and to see that casket proceed down to the Capitol building. We see them all bundled up, a lot of people in scarves and earmuffs and gloves. That's going to be similar to how things will be here on Thursday as well for his funeral at the cathedral. It's going to be a really cold morning, but we're still expecting a large turnout.
Now, when a commander-in-chief passes away prior to the person's passing, the presidential family will meet with officials to discuss basically what items are available to a president for funeral. We're told by some experts that Nancy Reagan selected basically every option that was given to her for former President Ronald Reagan. We are told that former President Gerald Ford, who was very close with President Carter, selected a scaled-down version, and so we'll be watching these events closely with President Carter to see whether they may more resemble former President Ford, former President Reagan's funeral, or I was out there 6 years ago for President George Herbert Walker Bush's funeral, farewell from the country. What about that? What about what we're looking forward to seeing in the hours and days ahead?
Well, certainly, with the caisson going down, traveling here to the Capitol building, there is pomp and circumstance with that. But I do believe with Jimmy Carter's funeral proceedings, we are going to kind of see that scaled back version of it all. And, that's just a nod to his upbringing. He's from rural Georgia, and his family wants his funeral to, signify that. He was a man of simplicity, a man of integrity. Even with him walking to the White House himself on his inauguration day, biographers have said he told his mother that he wanted to walk amongst the people that voted for him. So I think that we're going to see, yes, it's going to be a presidential funeral, and there is going to be some of that pomp and circumstance, but it's going to be at a much scaled back level to signify this man from Georgia.
Rebecca Castor live on Capitol Hill. Rebecca, thanks very much. This is the fourth day of public memorials for former President Carter. He lay in repose at the Carter Center in Atlanta until this morning, when he made the final trip to Washington more than 40 years after leaving the Oval Office. After an arrival ceremony at Joint Base Andrews, Carter's motorcade made a stop at the U.S. Navy Memorial as a tribute to his place as the only Naval Academy graduate to go on to become Commander-in-Chief. The procession is almost at the Capitol building, being led by a military formation. After the Carter family enters, there will be a 21-gun salute. Then the service will begin. We're expecting to hear eulogies from House Speaker Mike Johnson, Senate Majority Leader John Thune and Vice President Kamala Harris offering tributes to the ultimate Washington outsider who went from his family peanut farm to the governor's mansion and then the White House. And when you talk about an outsider, it is very popular these days to be a Washington outsider, but Jimmy Carter really was going from the peanut farm in Georgia to the governor's mansion and then ultimately on to the White House, but somebody who did not serve on Capitol Hill and was certainly not very close to a lot of the folks here in Washington. He did have a good relationship with current President Joe Biden. They were very close over the years, while Biden was the ultimate Washington insider, and we do expect President Biden to eulogize him at the funeral service on Thursday. Let's listen in to the ceremony. As we watch the procession heading down Pennsylvania Avenue down to the United States Capitol, I can tell you President Carter will lie in state at the Capitol until Thursday, where thousands of mourners are expected to pay their final tributes, despite the massive winter storm that paralyzed much of official Washington and the surrounding area. His funeral service will be held at Washington National Cathedral on Thursday afternoon. President Biden is expected to eulogize Carter. The two were close friends for decades, despite Carter's outsider image and strained relations with lawmakers on Capitol Hill. After the funeral, Carter's remains will return to Plains, Georgia, where he will be buried at his longtime home next to his wife, Rosalind, who passed away last year. The military component of today's funeral procession includes the U.S. Army Band, also known as Pershing's Own, which contains elements from every branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. There's also a riderless horse serving as a mounted escort to the late president. It is a moving farewell being outside of the U.S. Capitol when you see the casket of an American president returning to the Capitol for the American people to say their farewell. A very respectful scene. I recall being out there for President George Herbert Walker Bush in December 2018, and you're struck by the red, white, and blue pageantry, the all-American tribute to a former commander-in-chief, to someone who gave his life to service, and the American people turning out to say a respectful thank you and a respectful farewell. a prayerful farewell. It promises to be a touching service this afternoon and throughout the coming days as the American people say goodbye to the 39th President, James Earl Carter. Let's go back to the scene and listen in. You're looking live at the funeral procession for former President James Earl Carter, Jimmy Carter, here in Washington, heading near the United States Capitol building as his casket will make its way up to the United States Capitol Rotunda. I want to bring back in my colleague, Rebecca Castor. Rebecca, from where I can see it, it looks like the procession is heading by near where you are located. What are you seeing there?
Yes, so we are in the Senate Rotunda, and we can actually see from our balcony here that the procession is nearing the Capitol building. It's right outside our windows, so he's going to be arriving at the Capitol within minutes.
And we are seeing them approaching the steps where the procession will lead the casket and the Carter family up the steps to the Capitol. We understand the Carter family will head up the steps and then receive the casket at the top. And you can see the military procession there, the horse-drawn caisson being taken down Pennsylvania Avenue toward the Capitol building. Rebecca, I'm wondering, as you see folks around the Capitol complex, what the mood's been like with some of the people you've interacted with. Is there a more somber feeling on Capitol Hill on this important day?
Mm-hmm. Somber is definitely the word, and just watching people outside, walking about, this procession really just stops you in your tracks, and you just pause. Honestly, we're just seeing people pause, We're seeing people taking photos, just really taking in this historic moment for a former president that lived, over 100 years. So it's a very moving day here on Capitol Hill.
And my sense is a lot of folks will remember Jimmy Carter not so much for his presidency, but for the way he lived his life after leaving the White House, using the power of a former president to put the spotlight on a number of numerous causes, such as Habitat for Humanity, and really showing the American people that a president in good health can certainly do many, many good things across the country and around the globe after leaving the White House. Your thoughts on that, Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, Jimmy Carter definitely changed the way that presidents continue after they are done with their time in office. Creating the Carter Center, one of the first presidents to create a presidential library. His legacy for what presidents can do once they leave office, that's been a lasting legacy. And, for people my generation, honestly, they know Jimmy Carter not as president, but for everything that he accomplished once he left office.
Great point there. You can see a beautiful shot of the United States Capitol building with the flag lowered in honor of President Carter as the funeral procession makes its way to the east front of the Capitol, at which point the Military Honor Guard will escort the casket up the steps. It is worth noting that it does take some endurance. Those presidential caskets are quite heavy going up the steep steps of the U.S. Capitol building, and so you've got some of your best and brightest and perhaps strongest in uniform doing this honor duty to a former president of the United States. You can see them coming into formation on the plaza in front of the Capitol building. A really moving scene on a very cold day here in Washington, January the 7th. And there they are lining up for this solemn ceremony to guide the former president of the United States into the Capitol building, into the rotunda, for the official Washington farewell to really get underway. And as I mentioned earlier, we expect eulogies, remarks from the House Speaker Mike Johnson, Senate Majority Leader John Thune, and Vice President Kamala Harris. As President Biden is currently on the West Coast, we do expect President Biden to give an official eulogy on Thursday afternoon at the Washington Cathedral during that funeral service. Let's listen in as the president's casket's being guided into the Capitol building. So this is the start of a 3-day state funeral here in Washington for former President Jimmy Carter. And how this works is when a president dies, the House Speaker and the Majority Leader have to agree on the use of the Capitol Rotunda for a period of hours or days. Obviously, that's all been approved per the Carter family's wishes. There's a big book given to the families where they can pick out options for presidential funerals. Historians tell us Nancy Reagan chose all of the options. President Gerald Ford preferred the scaled-down version. Ford and Carter, despite being from different parties, were dear friends, and Carter was known for scaling things down, so we expect these services to be more straightforward and scaled back. It is very popular nowadays, of course, to say you are an outsider. President-elect Donald Trump is the ultimate outsider. Well, Jimmy Carter was an outsider too, a non-Washingtonian. He didn't come up in Washington like a Joe Biden. Historians tell us he didn't get along much with the United States Congress, and he went back to Georgia to live out his days. So that's also something to keep in mind during this Washington visit. Carter was a people's man. We've become familiar with seeing our presidents walk from the Capitol to the White House on Inauguration Day. In fact, we will see that happen again in 13 days when President-elect Trump becomes president for the second time. Well, Jimmy Carter started that in 1977. That walk to the Capitol is designed to mimic that, to pay homage to the tradition that Carter began. It is worth pointing out the weather and roads here in Washington are in pretty bad shape after a significant snowstorm, but there are plenty of people lined up to pay their respects. A lot of folks who didn't know President Carter or were even born when he was in office, but they wanted to come out of patriotism and tradition and respect for a life of service. Carter's casket will sit atop the Capitol catafalque, the big black box, if you will. If you've been to the Capitol, is normally stored in the crypt directly underneath where Carter will lie in state. The crypt was the original burial spot for President George Washington, but the Washington family chose not to bury him there. Washington never had this moment. Previous presidents had funerals at the White House. This tradition of lying in state actually began with President Abraham Lincoln's death. The catafalque was built for Lincoln in 1865. We don't know how much of the material is the original, but it is the same one. We've seen it used by the likes of Presidents Garfield, Roosevelt, Kennedy, Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, and more. Before the casket arrives into the Capitol Rotunda, the family will walk up the steps of the Capitol and stand to receive it. The last time we saw this was with President George Herbert Walker Bush. This is a truly powerful moment. You will remember President George W. Bush was visibly emotional as he put his hand over his heart and watched his father's casket brought up the steps. These caskets are extremely heavy. They take the casket up the east front of the Capitol, but one time when Gerald Ford died, they had to take it up the west front because there was construction of the visitor center. The west front's a lot higher, so they actually had to post different sets of guards to do it. No matter which side, it is an extraordinary feat. The Carter family did make a special request for the Rotunda ceremony. They wanted the podium to sit in front of Gerald Ford's statue as people make their remarks tonight. This is a nod to the deep and close personal friendship Carter had with President Ford. An odd couple, as they were sometimes known, this underlies bipartisanship in the way the family wants Jimmy Carter to be remembered as reaching across the aisle. And perhaps this is also a message to the nation watching as Carter returns to a much different Washington than he left. Let's listen in. To give you an indication of former President Carter was really a gentleman from a different era. He was a member of the Naval Academy class of 1947. Think about that, the class of 1947, and graduated in 1946 as part of an accelerated wartime program. Now, some more background information on the history of lying in state at the Capitol. A grand total of 34 people have lain in state in the Capitol Rotunda. That includes 12 presidents. The late President Carter becomes the 13th to lie in state. Others have lain in state in the Capitol building, such as late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and late Congressman Elijah Cummings of Maryland, but they were on the House side of the Capitol. 8 people have lain in honor in the Capitol Rotunda, which is similar, but one step down from lying in state. The last president to lie in state was the late President George Herbert Walker Bush in December 2018. The last person to lie in state was the late Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid of Nevada in January 2022. This time last year, we were all at the Iowa caucuses, but the first in the nation did not get much attention until 1976. That's when Jimmy Carter, a pretty unknown governor from Georgia, decided to focus on Iowa. He placed a surprising second in the Democratic caucus, which caught the attention of the national media and catapulted him to the Democratic nomination and ultimately the White House. Since then, almost all candidates of both parties have taken Iowa quite seriously. And today in Washington, it feels like an Iowa day in the 20s as former President Carter is being brought to the United States Capitol for the first day of his funeral procession here in Washington to take place, a truly solemn ceremony on the steps in front of the Capitol, where he will be greeted at the top of the steps by his family and accompanied into the Capitol Rotunda. Let's see if we can listen in and pick up some more audio of the ceremony. Looking back on the life of James Earl Carter, the 39th President of the United States, he was born on October 1st, 1924 in the small farming town of Plains, Georgia, and grew up in the nearby community of Archery. His father, James Earl Carter Sr., was a farmer and local businessman. His mother, Lillian Gordy Carter, was a registered nurse. He was educated in the public schools of Plains, attended Georgia Southwestern College and the Georgia Institute of Technology, and received a BS degree from the United States Naval Academy in 1946. In the Navy, he became a submariner, serving in both the Atlantic and Pacific fleets and rising to the rank of lieutenant. Chosen by Admiral Hyman Rickover for the nuclear submarine program, he was assigned to Schenectady, New York, where he took graduate work at Union College in reactor technology and nuclear physics, and served as senior officer of the pre-commissioning crew of the Seawolf, the second nuclear submarine. On July 7, 1946, he married Rosalind Smith of Plains. When his father died in 1953, he resigned his naval commission and returned with his family to Georgia. He took over the Carter Farms, and he and Rosalind operated Carter's Warehouse, a general-purpose seed and farm supply company in Plains. He quickly became a leader of the community, serving on county boards, supervising education, the hospital authority, and the library. In 1962, he won election to the Georgia Senate. He lost his first gubernatorial campaign in 1966, but won the next election, becoming Georgia's 76th governor on January 12, 1971. He was the Democratic National Committee campaign chairman for the 1974 congressional and gubernatorial elections. On December 12, 1974, he announced his candidacy for President of the United States. He won his party's nomination on the first ballot at the 1976 Democratic National Convention and was elected President of the United States on November 2nd, 1976. Jimmy Carter served as president from January 20th, 1977 to January 20th, 1981. Significant foreign policy accomplishments of his administration included the Panama Canal Treaties, the Camp David Accords, the Treaty of Peace between Egypt and Israel, the SALT II Treaty with the Soviet Union, and the establishment of U.S. diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. He championed human rights throughout the world. On the domestic side, the administration achieved achievements included a comprehensive energy program conducted by a new Department of Energy, deregulation in energy, transportation, communication, and finance, major educational programs under a new Department of Education, and major environmental protection legislation, including the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. Now let's go back to the scene live on Capitol Hill.
save, whose arms have bound the restless waves. We thank you for the inspiration of a consequential and laudable life as we celebrate the legacy of James Earl Carter, Jr., the 39th President of the United States. We proclaim your generosity to this nation and world for giving us the gift of someone with the ethical congruence to be salt and light to his generation. Lord, he made the world more palatable. We thank you for his passion for integrity, his commitment to leave the world better than he found it, and his exemplary love for his precious Rosalind. Inspired by his great life, teach us to know you more clearly, to love you more dearly, and to follow you more nearly each day. We pray in your matchless name. Amen.
Madam Vice President, Mr. Speaker, Leader Schumer, Leader Jeffries, Jack, Chip, Jeff, Amy, and other members of the Carter family, and distinguished guests. Today we gather to begin a final farewell to Jimmy Carter, Navy veteran, peanut farmer, Governor of Georgia, and President of the United States. Sunday school teacher, Nobel Prize winner, advocate for peace and human rights, and first and foremost, a faithful servant of his Creator and his fellow man. In a commencement speech he delivered at Liberty University back in 2018, President Carter told a story about going on a mission to Massachusetts back in his younger days under the auspices of the Southern Baptist Convention. During that trip, President Carter was impressed by the success of a fellow missionary in winning souls to Christ. And so as the mission was winding down, he asked him what made him so successful. He was a little embarrassed by my question, President Carter recalled, but then he finally said, I try to have two loves in my heart. One love is for God, and the other love I have in my heart is for the person who happens to be in front of me at any particular time. It was a statement President Carter said that he never forgot. I think it's fair to say that it's also a statement he lived by. President Carter's term as president ended in 1981. And for the remainder of his life, the longest post-presidency of any American president ever, he focused on making the lives of his fellow men better. That meant things like the Carter Center, which among other things works for the eradication of disease in some of the poorest areas of the globe. And it meant things like his work with Habitat for Humanity to provide affordable housing for those in need. And when I say his work with Habitat for Humanity, I do mean his work. Jimmy Carter knew that his status as a former president could bring attention to good causes. It's why he encouraged Habitat to make use of his name and image. But simply lending his name, or maybe attending a gala or two, wasn't Jimmy Carter's style. He was here to get down in the weeds and the dirt, and he did that literally on numerous Habitat builds, including one back in 1994 in Eagle Butte in my home state of South Dakota. Well into his 90s, he could be found with his hard hat and tools on construction sites doing the practical work required to get families into homes. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And Jimmy Carter did his very best to live according to the calling of his Lord and Savior. Today, I join all Americans in mourning President Carter and remembering his example. But I rejoice in the thought that he, together with his beloved wife, Rosalind, is now before the face of his Father.
To the family, to Jack and Chip and Jeff and Amy, the entire Carter family, Vice President Harris, members of the Cabinet, Leader Thune, my colleagues in Congress, and my fellow citizens. We meet in this sacred hall of self-government to honor an extraordinary man, a man who modeled the virtues of service and citizenship, as well as any other American. Surrounding us are the statues of those who gave their time, their energy, and their lives for the good of America. Before us lays a man who now joins their midst as a patriot, a veteran, a humanitarian, and the 39th President of the United States. When Jimmy Carter walked out on the east front of the Capitol and took his oath of office, I was just 4 years old, and he's the first president that I remember. Looking back, it's obvious now to me as an adult why he captured everyone's attention. Jimmy Carter was a member of the greatest generation. He lived through the Great Depression. He did that on a farm in rural Georgia. He knew the value of a dollar, and he modeled thrift his entire life. As long as he was in office, he hated government waste. His father, an Army veteran of the World War I era, taught patriotism to his children. And eventually his son, this young man from Plains, followed his father's example of self-sacrifice, and he joined the Naval Academy in the middle of World War II. In the Army, Lieutenant Carter learned from the legendary Admiral Rickover to always do his best as he served on the first fleet of nuclear submarines. It's telling that today the USS Jimmy Carter, a top-secret attack submarine, now roams the oceans, bearing the name of the only president who served in such close quarters. President Carter's life, his selfless service, his fight against cancer, and his lasting contributions to his fellow man are all truly remarkable. Whether he was in the White House or in his post-presidential years, as was discussed, President Carter was willing to roll up his own sleeves to serve and get the job done. We all know about his work with Habitat for Humanity, and that was mentioned. And the origin story goes that it was in 1984, when he first became aware of the work. He was in New York for a friend's anniversary. Millard Fuller, the founder of the fledgling charity at the time, called President Carter and asked if he wanted to visit a site in Brooklyn during his trip. President Carter agreed, and he found his way down to the Lower East Side. Standing on the roof of a dilapidated building, he looked out on the wealth of Wall Street to the south and to the power of Midtown Manhattan to the north. And then he looked down, and he saw an image he'd never forget. An elderly woman cooking breakfast over an open fire in the rubble of the building, there in the heart of the richest city in the world. The Habitat for Humanity worker that was there with him turned to President Carter and said, if there's anything that you can do, we would take it. He said, if there's anything I can do, let me know. The worker said, well, maybe you can send some volunteer carpenters from your church. It was the very next day that President Carter called Habitat for Humanity and told them he was going to send some carpenters, all right, and that he himself would be one of them. And thus began his famous tradition of donating 1 week every year to build and restore homes for his fellow Americans. It's remarkable to think that one of the 45 men who has served as president and one of the only 13 who held the role in the nuclear age would humble himself to such service. We all know that his care for humanity didn't stop at building homes. In the face of illness, President Jimmy Carter brought life-saving medicine. In the face of conflict, he brokered peace. In the face of discrimination, he reminded us that we are all made in the image of God. And if you were to ask him why he did it all, he would likely point to his faith. I'm reminded of his admonition to, quote, live our lives as though Christ were coming this afternoon, and of his amazing personal reflection. Quote, if I have one life and one chance to make it count for something. We all agree that he certainly did. So today in these hallowed halls of our republic, we honor President Carter, his family, and his enduring legacy that he leaves, not only upon this nation, but upon the world.
Leader Thune, Speaker Johnson, Leader Schumer, Leader Jeffries, members of Congress, and distinguished guests. It is an honor to be with you this afternoon, and to Jack, Chip, Jeff, Amy, and Jason, and all the other members of the Carter family. On behalf of the American people, Doug and I offer our deepest condolences. Being with you today, I'm reminded of the enduring words of a favorite hymn. May the works I have done speak for me. Today we gather to celebrate the life of a man whose works will echo for generations to come. A man from Plains, Georgia, who grew up without electricity or running water, and served as the 39th President of the United States of America, and lived every day of his long life in service to the people. President James Earl Carter, Jr. So I was in middle school when Jimmy Carter was elected president, and I vividly recall how my mother admired him, how much she admired his strength of character, his honesty, his integrity, his work ethic and determination, his intelligence, and his generosity of spirit. We have heard much today and in recent days about President Carter's impact in the 4 decades after he left the White House. Rightly so. Jimmy Carter established a new model for what it means to be a former president, and leaves an extraordinary post-presidential legacy. From founding the Carter Center, which has helped advance global human rights and alleviate human suffering, to his public health work in Latin America and Africa, to his tireless advocacy for peace and democracy, to his Jimmy Carter was a president of the United States who was ahead of his time. He was the first president of the United States who was ahead of his time. He was the first president of the United States. He also passed over a dozen major pieces of legislation regarding environmental protection, and more than doubled the size of America's national parks, including protecting our beloved redwoods in my home state of California. He was a president who, between the years of 1977 and 1981, appointed more Black Americans to the federal bench than all of his predecessors combined, and appointed 5 times as many women. And in the wake of Watergate, Jimmy Carter passed historic ethics legislation to help rebuild America's faith in government. Jimmy Carter, as president, was also a respected global leader. To be sure, the years of his presidency were not without international crises or challenges, but his legacy of global leadership is well established. In Asia, he instituted full diplomatic relations with China, which he would later call one of the most historically significant accomplishments of his presidency. And his legacy lives on in the Middle East because, do recall, in the decades before Jimmy Carter became president, Israel and Egypt had been at war numerous times. Few thought peace could be achieved between them. Yet Jimmy Carter did that. Through his persistence and perseverance, through his unshakable belief in the power of American diplomacy, he secured the Camp David Accords, one of the most significant and durable peace treaties since World War II. And throughout the world, Jimmy Carter elevated the role of human rights in America's foreign policy priorities and uplifted the importance of civil society in doing that work. Jimmy Carter was a forward-looking president with a vision for the future. Consider his establishment of the Department of Energy in 1977, which anticipated the central role it would play in addressing the climate crisis. His creation of FEMA in 1979, which enabled our nation to mobilize a national response to disasters, which has helped countless communities rebuild and recover. And his founding of the Department of Education later that year, which elevated public education institutions and increased national standards for the education of America's children and future leaders. Jimmy Carter was that all too rare example of a gifted man who also walks with humility, modesty, and grace. Recall the stories from the 1976 campaign about how he slept in the homes of his supporters to share a meal with them at their table and to listen to what was on their minds. How on their first trip for Habitat for Humanity, Jimmy and Rosalind rode the bus with the other volunteers. And when the group stopped for the night to stay at a local church, Jimmy and Rosalind gave their private room to a young couple who had put off their honeymoon to join the trip. And with the other volunteers, they then slept on the floor of the church basement. And then, of course, his work to eradicate the vicious guinea worm disease that once disabled millions of people a year. It was one of the Carter Center's greatest triumphs, and Jimmy Carter, of course, given his nature, attributed its success not to his own leadership, but to the thousands of everyday Africans who were on the ground doing the work. Throughout his life and career, Jimmy Carter retained a fundamental decency and humility. James Earl Carter Jr. loved our country. He lived his faith, he served the people, and he left the world better than he found it. And in the end, Jimmy Carter's work and those works speak for him, louder than any tribute we can offer. May his life be a lesson for the ages and a beacon for the future. May God bless President Jimmy Carter, and may God bless the United States of America.
My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my
Holy and loving God, receive into your eternal joy your good and faithful servant, James Earl Carter, Jr. Reward him richly and grant him your own well done for his humble and honorable life, worth far more than the many accolades and attributions we have gladly given. May President Jimmy Carter now rest from his labors and be received into the embrace of your everlasting arms. And when the ceremony and fanfare due this man of character and compassion fades into history, when the processions and parades have dispersed, leave with us, O God, the lasting impression and inspiration of a life well lived. Ignite in us the same passion for public service, the courage to champion the underserved, the strength to bear as faithfully the weight of the call to which you have called each one of us, to do as justly, to love mercy as unreservedly, to walk as humbly with you as we have witnessed in the testimony of President Jimmy Carter's life of faithfulness. We offer our prayers in the name of the one whom Jimmy Carter would have known to be the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega, his rock and our Redeemer. Amen.
You can see the emotion on the faces of Carter family members as Washington begins its official goodbye to the 39th President of the United States. Senate Majority Leader John Thune praising Carter for working in his post-presidency to make life better for his fellow man. Vice President Harris noted President Carter's legacy after leaving office in public health and in service to others. For the latest on this story and all the day's news, stay with this Fox station in Washington. I'm Mike Emanuel. Good afternoon.